Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Butler from FaithTrust Institute. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Meaningful Voices Book Club. We're excited to discuss trauma stewardship. It's a fabulous book, and hopefully you've had a chance to read it and have lots of questions and comments for discussion. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that you should be able to see me, or no, hear me, and see the screen on the, see on your screen the slide that says technical information. If you're having problems with your sound, I recommend that you check and make sure your headset is plugged in or your speakers, and turn up the volume. And if that doesn't fix it, then try exiting out of the webinar and then reconnecting. Usually that will fix the technical issues. We want to hear your questions and comments, and you can submit your questions by clicking on the little question box. If you can't see that, then click on the orange arrow and that will expand your options. The other thing to let you know is that we have several resources that you can download, and you should see on your screen an area that says handouts, and that's where you can download those resources. So we're going to take a little poll here to find out who you are and where you're coming from and how you relate to this issue. So let's see. I don't know if you can see the poll, but if you would just, yeah, that's great. Just give us a sense of who you are. I'm going to give you a few more seconds. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and close that up. So let's see, it looks like 50% of the folks joining us are clergy members, 33% are advocates or social workers, 17% volunteers, activists, 17% teachers. So thank you for letting us know. So I want to introduce our presenters today. So Reverend Dr. Sally MacNichol is the co-executive director of Connect, a New York City nonprofit dedicated to preventing interpersonal violence and promoting gender justice. Emily Cohen is a program manager here at FaithTrust Institute, and she holds a Master of Divinity from Harvard University, where she studied gender-based violence, pastoral care, and Buddhism. So I'm going to hand this over to you, and let's get started.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Sarah, and welcome everyone who's online with us tonight, or you may be listening to the recording later on. Sally and I know are both really excited to talk about this book that's been so meaningful for us in so many different ways. And we were chatting earlier about just what a joy it was to reread the book for this event tonight, and each time we go back to it, it seems like new things unfold and kind of enrich our learning even more. So we're glad you're here, and we are just going to go ahead and jump right in and get started. And as Sarah said, we do hope to hear from lots of you. So if you have questions or comments or examples of how this book has been helpful for you in your various roles, we hope that you can just type that into the chat at any moment. We like to hear from you. So we just want to start by kind of helping ground this discussion in these umbrella terms and kind of set the context for the rest of our conversation together. I assume some of you have read the book, but maybe not all of you. You just heard about it, and maybe this conversation will encourage you to go out and get the book for yourself. So I'm sure many of you have heard lots of these words and phrases to describe what in trauma stewardship is called trauma exposure response. So phrases like compassion fatigue, secondary trauma, vicarious traumatization, burnout, caregiver stress, secondary PTSD or secondary trauma. And these are all different words that basically are trying to get at what is on the right side of the screen there, which is the natural response to witnessing the suffering of others, which impacts our physical and psychological and spiritual well-being. One way that I like to think about this concept is a quote that I heard from a woman named Rachel Naomi Remen, who's a medical doctor. And she says that the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. And this is so helpful for me because it reminds us that trauma exposure response and all of those other ways that we call that, it's a natural response. It is a matter of course and a natural consequence. It is not necessarily, it's not at all a sign that we are doing our work wrong or that we don't have some innate quality. And Sally, do you want to talk a little bit about the term compassion fatigue?
Yeah, Emily and I were, hello everybody. It's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And Emily and I were talking earlier about compassion fatigue and had both heard that for some people, compassion is a quality that is renewing. And in giving compassion, I think we have to cultivate compassion and become skillful compassion givers for this to be the case. But when we are skillful in it, fatigue is not really something that needs to happen, that we will be fed by that compassion. So we'll be talking about that more in terms of being present and other things coming up. But I think it's an interesting idea to think about that. I heard Dr. Daniel Siegel say, no, you can never get tired from being compassionate. So
it's a really helpful framing.
Yeah, I think it's.
Okay, can you click the next slide, Sarah?
Okay. I finally came to understand that my exposure to other people's traumas had changed me on a fundamental level. I had absorbed and accumulated trauma to the point that it had become a part of me, and my view of the world had changed. I had come into my work armed with a burning passion and a tremendous commitment, but few other internal resources. As you know, there is a time for fire, but what sustains the heat for the long haul is the coals, and coals I had none of. It never occurred to me that my anger might in part be functioning as a shield against what I was experiencing. I had no clue that I was warding off anguish. That's a pretty powerful statement about trauma exposure response. And I think it's important, and I appreciate this about the book too. I mean, this is, and you were talking about this, Emily, a little, this is not easy, and it's not always easy to come to distinguish the ways in which your view of the world has changed, which is why community is so important, and people to talk to is so important, because I think it just becomes so much a part of your everyday life if you're doing this kind of work as a clergy person, as an advocate, a trauma counselor of any kind, a teacher, that you don't really notice. So I think that's an important, just to acknowledge that it's difficult. And the coals, I mean, I think developing those embers and having the coals, the ongoing fire, not flaming fire that you can draw from, is what trauma stewardship is about. How to sustain and continue to cultivate the strength to, stay in the work. And then the part about anger, I don't know if you want to say something about anger, Emily, but that is a tricky one, I think, because I remember I always used to say, I love my anger, because I felt like it protected me, that it was better than not being able to get out of bed in the morning. And so anger is really complicated, and a complicated emotion for me.
Yeah, I think that's something that they do so well in this book, is helping us understand that joy and suffering coexist. And if we really are to be in touch with the work that we're doing that is so attached to seeing suffering and seeing trauma on such a regular basis, we also need to have time to really provide space to grieve and to make meaning about all the things that we're seeing. And to be able to recognize and acknowledge that it takes a toll on us because we are human beings who need to have time to grieve and be angry and feel joy and be attached to things that are also really happy and, not about all those negative things. And they do such a good job of kind of depicting that. And this quote reminded me of just I want to read the first 2 paragraphs from the book because I think it really illustrates what they're talking about when they say that other people's trauma had changed me on a fundamental level. And just in general, I think the frame of this book as like a mode of self-care that is not just, make sure you eat vegetables and take a bath, which are of course so important, but really addressing the complexity of how the trauma has changed us. So if you've read the book, you know this story already, but if you haven't, it's the story that I always tell people when I am recommending this book to them, because I think it illustrates the wisdom in it. So I'm just going to read the first 2 paragraphs in the book. So Laura is writing this. She says, "Are you sure all this trauma work hasn't gotten to you?" he asked. "We were visiting our relatives in the Caribbean. We had hiked to the top of some cliffs on a small island, and for a moment the entire family stood quietly together, marveling, looking out at the sea. It was an exquisite sight. There was turquoise water as far as you could see, a vast cloudless sky, and air that felt incredible to breathe. As we reached the edge of the cliffs, my first thought was, this is unbelievably beautiful. My second thought was, I wonder how many people have killed themselves by jumping off these cliffs. Assuming that everyone around me would be having exactly the same thought, I posed my question out loud. My stepfather-in-law turned to me slowly and asked his question with such sincerity that I finally understood. My work had gotten to me. I didn't even tell him the rest of what I was thinking, which was, where will the helicopter land? Where is the closest level 1 trauma center? Can they transport from this island to a hospital? How long will it take? Does all the Caribbean share a trauma center? It was quite a list. I had always considered myself a self-aware person, but this was the first time I truly comprehended the degree to which my work had transformed the way that I engaged the world. And so this is helpful in just kind of framing the approach to the book, but also, many of us can apply this in our own settings of seeing a scenario that doesn't in and of itself give us any signs that something is wrong, and yet we can start to do those things in our mind and catastrophize and apply our layers of trauma exposure to it.
I love that story.
Okay, let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
So this is a good segue from the story I've just told about really the quote there on the left that says, when we refer to trauma exposure response, we're talking about the ways in which the world looks and feels like a different place as a result of our doing our work. And so in this section in the book, they survey 16 warning signs of trauma exposure response that are shown around the wheel there on the slide. We'll highlight just a few. Since there are so many, they all have their own section in the book with lots of helpful examples, but we'll just highlight a few. And what they mean by trauma exposure response is when external trauma becomes an internal reality. So she writes that when this happens as a result of our work, it can catch us off guard. And the thought that the pain around us can actually change our own psychological and physiological responses, altering our worldview, may never have occurred to us. We often assume that our very status as helpers grants us immunity from the suffering we witness, and we're often wrong about this. They also give a lot of wisdom and gentleness around just the process of learning about trauma exposure response can be one that makes us feel defensive or freaked out in some way when you start to kind of realize like, oh geez, this is really happening and I'm really experiencing these things. I think Sally and I, and along with the authors, would encourage you all to just like have some gentleness with yourself about it.
Oh yeah.
And some patience. And that's why I think this book lends itself to reading like over time, taking it a section at a time, kind of letting it simmer and then coming back to it.
Yeah.
But I just want to highlight a couple of these warning signs, and then Sally will do the same. So let's look at hypervigilance. So they talk about hypervigilance in our work with creating the dynamic of being wholly focused on our job to the extent that being present for anything else in our life can seem impossible. There's an example, in the book, they have so many anecdotes and stories from people across different disciplines, which is also really helpful to recognize that trauma exposure response affects people who are doing conservation biology work, who are doing domestic violence work, who are teachers, educators, just like all of you who are online today. So there's this little quote that stuck with me from a DV protection order advocate that is used as an example of hypervigilance. And the DV advocate said she recently received photos from a friend's wedding, and as she sat there looking through them, she thought to herself, I wonder when the domestic violence is going to start. And for her, this was this kind of moment of realizing, like, she's working with domestic violence victims all the time, has heard, the worst of the worst stories, and is then kind of hypervigilant and projecting that possibility onto situations that may have no, again, indications that that is a possibility. I think hypervigilance is really tricky and hard because thinking of the DV advocate who is working with so many victims all the time, that person may be sensitive to warning signs that other people can't see all the time. And so sometimes the hypervigilance is, it turns out to be true, or that there are things that are about that are actually true or possible. And so I think it's, again, coming back to self-awareness, which we'll talk about, like finding that balance.
Yeah, and I think just to jump in for a minute, Emily, the hypervigilance is, it points to this loss of trust in a sense of safety, which is what trauma is. It, robs you of a sense of safety. And so then you start to question yourself sometimes when you, as you were saying, you can be very vigilant and see clearly something that other people might not see. But then you can step back and question yourself because you're going, oh, I'm hypervigilant, and you lose trust in your own instincts. And that's a very difficult place to be when you start to lose trust in your own, perceptions.
Yeah.
And it's very isolating. Another hallmark of trauma.
Right. So. Yeah, that's so true. Just one more to kind of highlight would be minimizing. So minimizing occurs when we trivialize a current situation by comparing it with another situation that we regard as more dire. So one quote from the book says, this coping strategy is at its worst when you've witnessed so much that you begin to downplay anything that doesn't fall into the most extreme category of hardship. So if something happens to you as a caregiver, you say, well, it doesn't matter because the person that I was serving today has going through so much worse. And so I shouldn't even, acknowledge my own suffering. Kind of putting everything into a hierarchy, or downplaying very real experiences of suffering because they're not as extreme as you've heard.
One of the ones that I see a lot and have experienced a lot are dissociative moments. And I think particularly because we have some clergy on the line and surely other folks who are, have spiritual practices, it made me think about spiritual bypassing, where, of course, dissociative moments are when you simply have to leave so you don't, so you can protect yourself from the trauma that you're hearing over and over again. And I think sometimes spiritual bypassing can be meaning that we use spirituality. And this is another thing I love about this book, because she's so clear about, taking our time, going deep, and being able, as Emily said, and as we'll talk about more, being able to look at both joy and sorrow running concurrently and intertwining. But I think that sometimes I've seen people use their spirituality to jump away from suffering and the suffering that they're working on. And so I think that's an important thing to think about. And another, and there's so many here, but I think another danger or something that comes up with a trauma exposure response is you can have a sense of persecution, especially when you do work that maybe makes other people feel uncomfortable. And you can sometimes say, and I remember, very many times in my life as a domestic violence advocate, people would say, "What do you do?" And I would say, and they go, "Oh, how can you do that work?" And that's really, and I just used to say, like, I feel like people are going, like, stay away.
Yeah.
But that can really affect your, it can take a deep toll, and you can have a sense of like, you become more isolated, you feel a little persecuted, and depending on what kinds of traumas you're working on then, and we'll talk about this more, but there are political implications to them that can also make you feel separate and isolated too. So I think those are, those are things to watch for.
One more thing, if I can jump in, one more thing about
sure.
Just this quote on the left here, that the world looks and feels like a different place as a result of trauma exposure response. I think too, thinking through groups that I've worked with and that we've worked with at FaithTrust to respond to clergy misconduct or clergy abuse is the ways in which people who are engaged in that work, not only does the world look and feel like a different place, but that person's religion or religious community can look and feel like a different place, or their spiritual practices. And so that's been another dimension of the book that's been helpful for me and helpful in, the education that we do around boundaries and misconduct is trying to help people understand how to navigate their own spiritual communities in which there may be harm happening. And how does that change how you relate to your tradition? That's another topic.
Yeah. Should we go on, or there's so many on this?
There's so much. I know there's so much in all of here, but let's keep going.
Yeah, let's keep going. Okay. So, so this is something I so appreciate about this book, that she gives a comprehensive, multidimensional sense of trauma exposure response with these 3 levels of impact. I think often there is a lot of emphasis on self-care, and sometimes that becomes very narrow and doesn't include organizational or societal and even deeper parts of individuals. So I really appreciate that. But so, of course, on the individual level, it matters that we take a look at who we are when we bring ourselves to the work, and why are we doing the work? What's compelling us to do the work the hard work that we're doing? What's our own trauma history? So we have to be very careful of, and just aware of what we're bringing. Now, if we're coming to work that involves the same kind of trauma that we ourselves have gone through, that can be a positive thing, but it also has some dangers in terms of over-identifying or actually thinking that people that we're working with might be going through similar process. And we know, at least in my work, which is gender violence, no situation is the same. You cannot say that anything is like anything else. I mean, there's some very deep basic things, but we can never make those assumptions. So it's just really important to balance out our own compassion and empathy, which can overflow, and with very ongoing self-awareness. And of course, that's what the book is really about. And but that's really important. And then to move to the organizational level, organizations have their own trauma histories, for one thing, and have a tremendous impact on how the individuals in it are going to deal with their trauma exposure response. I'm lucky to work in an organization that, we take a lot of time to, we give ourselves space to be able to talk things out. Today we were having a staff meeting, which we were laughing hysterically. We just decided that we really needed some humor, and humor is an important part of working with being a good trauma steward. Is to maintain your humor, which sometimes can be really hard, but organizationally, it's true that the more supportive an organization is of people speaking out their truth around their own history and what they're working with, the less damaging the trauma exposure can be. And I know that there are many organizations. There's a part where she talks about someone talking about service rationing, and we see this a lot with some of the people that we do education with. That when you start to learn about trauma and you learn more about your own trauma and other people's trauma, and then you start to realize how not supportive your organization is, and the fact that you're being asked to do so much and you want to give so much to the people you're seeing, but because of resources, because of so many things, but resources and the way organizations are structured, there's such a clash there, and so you start rationing. This saying, well, I'll just do this much here, and you've got to do it for people who have to do it, but it creates a lot of pain and suffering for people who are doing that work. So I think it's really good for anybody listening to this and to read her part about organizations and to think about the ways, the spaciousness and the time and that's given to people who are experiencing trauma. And then, do you want to say anything, Emily?
I will after the next one.
Okay. So, and I think this is the hard one. This is the societal, and the fact that, this is again, that she says very clearly that you have to talk about trauma stewardship in the context of oppression, in the context of structural violence and systemic oppression. We can't do it without that, because that's so much of where the trauma, just like it does for the people that we work with, there can be individual trauma, but then, well, at least in the work that I do, there's the individual trauma that comes from the personal situation, but then there's a systemic re-traumatization that happens. And for those of us working and trying to find resources for people, when we know that those resources, sometimes the ones available are not, can be as harmful as the original traumas, it's extremely difficult to work with that. And we just have to, it's tremendously helpful, actually, organizationally, to be able to also talk not just about individual, but also about the societal, the systemic stuff that's going on. So I think those things need to be all held together.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is one of the reasons why I think this book is so amazing, is because it does take into account these three areas.
Right.
So much of what, I've seen in other settings or from other resources really are only about the individual, really only about what can I do as an individual to make myself healthier, to take better care of myself, which is of course so important. But it always kind of falls short of really capturing what is happening in trauma exposure and taking into consideration that there are so many interlocking factors, especially when you can finally acknowledge systemic oppression and realize what a force that is and how it trickles down into the other layers. So being able to talk about how structural violence or classism or racism or the oppression that we may find in some of our religious traditions or communities, how those things are also interwoven in an individual or an organizational's ability to be good trauma stewards. So I just really appreciate this aspect of the book.
Yeah, and I think that just in the way that sometimes we help the people we're working with to understand those interlocking oppressions and take it out of the personal realm, as
Right.
because very often people think I caused this, but when you start to critically think about your environment, and it's the same thing for those of us working, that we do have to have compassion for ourselves, because sometimes we work in such we don't have what we need. I'm sure everybody on this call knows what we're talking about. I mean, we're overwhelmed a lot of the times, and to understand that there's just so much that we can do, and to keep being in community and figuring out ways to change it. But, so should we go to the next?
Yes, let's go to the next slide. And I'm just going to read this and comment briefly on it, and then we can move to the next couple slides, which I think we really want to focus on. So trauma exposure response is a boundary issue. This one comes up towards the beginning of the book, and she writes that often people begin recognizing the effect of trauma exposure when they realize they are behaving in ways they never would have when they first started working in their field. Perhaps when workers start out, they have the energy required to navigate the gray areas of their work, to question their assumptions, to stay open-minded about what's possible, and to truly believe that it matters if they do right in the work and in the world. Over time, the complexity of the issues may surface, the scarcity of resources may feel overwhelming, and one may feel more and more isolated. At that point, a sense of entitlement creeps in. We may feel so desperate for satisfaction that we will try to meet the client's needs by any means necessary. And so what if it compromises the integrity of the work? After all, who's going to notice? Who's going to care? So she kind of depicts this perfect storm of many different factors coming together. And, in our work at FaithTrust, in the prevention and intervention work we do around healthy boundaries. So of course, many of you know we do a lot of healthy boundaries training with clergy and other helpers, and intervention work after misconduct has occurred. And in the prevention work that we do, we know that it's so important to be rooted in self-care and to really view self-care as one of the foundations of healthy boundaries. And this book is so helpful in kind of complexifying what self-care means. It doesn't just mean simple things, but it means really being able to pay attention and understand and investigate your trauma exposure response and finding ways to deal with that are helpful and meaningful. So often in our work, when we see boundaries having been violated, it often is a leader who has long abandoned their spiritual practice or is isolated in so many ways, doesn't have the organizational support. All these different factors that have gone into it often are present. Of course, some people are predators, and that's a different kind of topic, but really acknowledging that trauma exposure can impact our behavior and make us do things that we wouldn't normally do.
Just quickly, in it says at that point a sense of entitlement creeps in, and it makes me go think back to one of the words on that circle is grandiosity. And I think what happens too, since we're already helpers and we have to be careful about being rescuers, and sometimes people feel that entitlement shows up as like, I don't care because I'm going to save this situation. And it gets very, that breaks a boundary too. And there's this sort of heroic, I have to do this even though it's breaking the rules because so I think there's that grandiosity thing in there.
And there's a quote somewhere, I don't have it pulled out at the moment, but she basically says, only by understanding the landscape that we're lost in can we begin to plot the wisest way out, I think is the quote. And so she's depicting in this quote some sort of basically a sense of being lost and not really like losing our way in some way. And so trauma exposure response in this book, I feel like gives tools to be able to kind of plot the landscape and say, okay, here's where I am, here's why I'm here, how can I get out?
Yeah, really good.
Okay, let's keep going.
Okay. So I'm going to read this. Trauma stewardship is a daily practice through which individuals, organizations, and societies tend to the hardship, pain, or trauma experienced by humans, other living beings, or our planet itself. Those who support trauma stewardship believe that both joy and pain are realities of life, and that suffering can be transformed into meaningful growth and healing when a quality of presence is cultivated and maintained, even in the face of great suffering. Although trauma stewardship tells us we have choices about where to put our focus, it does not simply involve putting on a happy face. This approach demands that we embrace a paradox. If we are truly to know joy, we cannot afford to shut down our experience of pain. And I think that's very much the heart of the matter. And again, why this concept of trauma stewardship is really distinctive and deep. And we've mentioned it before, but just embracing this paradox. And I think that's not easy, especially because I think sometimes we can embrace the trauma, response is we can embrace the pain all too much. And sometimes we do lose our connection with experiencing joy. And even there's a guilt that can come with experiencing joy. And it's a huge, or it was for me, a big spiritual lesson to really embrace that paradox and say, it's good for me to embrace joy. It's good for us to live joyfully and take joyful action in the world. And in fact, that's really part of, it's almost like a requirement, that's really part of the struggle to work with and not close our eyes to the pain and the suffering around us. So I just think that's beautiful. And there was another quote in there, and I'm not sure what page it was on, but I really liked it, which was to participate in trauma stewardship is to always remember the privilege and sacredness of being called to help. And I think this book is really about that sacredness too, and to name that and to name it as a spiritual calling. Trauma stewardship is so important. So yeah, I love this quote.
It's really great. I think if we can go to the next slide too, I think this kind of continues to clarify this concept.
Mm-hmm. I love this so much. Abandon, and this is from Pema Chodron, who's a Buddhist nun, American Buddhist monk nun of the Tibetan tradition. Abandon any hope of fruition. The key instruction is to stay in the present. Don't get caught up in hopes of what you'll achieve and how good your situation, and you could add there, and the person you're working, if you're working with a client or someone, or whatever your situation will be someday in the future. What you do right now is what matters. I love abandon any hope of fruition. I think it's such a critical part of the practice of trauma stewardship, because when we get caught up in wanting a certain outcome, we actually remove ourselves from being in the present moment and being in the situation that calls us to be right there. So I know that the idea of being in the present at every moment is a challenging one. And even recently, I just saw an article yesterday saying, no, that's impossible. And it was by a scientist. But But the idea is that to cultivate self-awareness, so that you can, empty out really, so you can stay present and cleanse your, because what happens is you're going, okay, I've got to do this, I've got to do this, I've got to take care of this, I've got to, maybe if I say this, and in that you stop listening and you stop being present. And I just think it's very countercultural to abandon any hope of fruition, but it's really a good practice. And it also requires a deep cultivation of, or recovery often of trust, because there's always going to be a space in there where you don't know what to do. And you have to be okay with, maybe I don't know what to do and I'm just here. So it's really important.
And I think helpful to take these kinds of quotes. Of course, it is like easier said than done, but also remember that it's a practice. Like you're saying, Sally, it is a practice, and there are things you can do, which we'll get into in the next couple of slides, really about being in the present moment in a particular way and asking yourself specific questions. And having some, of course, bringing common sense to this. So abandon any hope of fruition. Of course, we don't mean abandon any hope. It's important that, it's like not the same thing. But I think sometimes these kinds of quotes get taken in the wrong direction. And so, just to kind of name that this is, these are some
that's important.
To be in the face of suffering.
Yeah.
But let's talk a little bit more about that in the next slide.
Yeah.
And just spend the next few minutes, because we want to leave some time at the end for everyone's questions. And I know it always goes by quickly. And so for the next few minutes, we just want to talk about the 5 directions. And in the book, the chapters devoted to the 5 directions are the last several. So it's the last chunk of the book. And the author writes that, just some background and context for the 5 directions. She says, in developing the 5 directions, I have drawn upon a vision of the world that was common to many early cultures in Asia, the Americas, and even in Europe. In addition to the 4 cardinal directions, north, east, south, and west, the ancients envisioned a 5th direction. This was sometimes seen as the core element that linked Earth to both the heavens and the underworld. It has been described as the center, or here, or spiritual direction. For our purposes, the 5th direction is our own interconnected human core, or our centered self. And so these chapters, she takes each of the directions and goes into them and really speaks to ways that we can begin to build daily practices of centering ourselves. So if you have the book, this is on the very back cover, this same graphic. And so you can look and see that she associates and again draws upon these various traditions in early cultures. She's drawing from a lot of indigenous wisdom and various cultures around the world. So north being associated with blue and water, about creating space for inquiry, really focusing on questions like, why am I doing what I'm doing? Going to east, fire and orange is about choosing our focus and having questions around, where am I putting my focus? What's my plan B? And in the plan B, she talks about developing some self-awareness around, if I wasn't doing this particular work, what else would I be doing? Or how else can I do my particular work differently? And kind of thinking about that. South is associated with earth and green and building compassion and community. And I'll talk a little bit about this one in more detail, just because I feel connected to it and like this one. So she talks about creating a microculture and building compassion and community. So I kind of associate this with like the rootedness of being rooted like a tree, like in the earth. And let me just read one little piece here. She says, to the south, we call upon the peace and renewal that come from the earth element. By developing a microculture of supportive friends and family, we create an environment that sustains us, just as the earth does. By being compassionate to ourselves and others, we ground ourselves. This is where we come out of isolation, tap into the core energies of Mother Nature, and tend to both our individual and collective health and wellness. So I like this culture of this concept of creating a microculture. which she
I
says,
love that.
yeah, she says it should support us in two ways, which is by showering us with encouragement and by holding us accountable. And so these are people who we should be able to debrief with, laugh with, cry with, brainstorm with, all of the above. And really, I think is an antidote to isolation, which we've talked about as being such a problem and
Yeah.
exacerbate all these things. And then the last one is air in the West, which is associated with finding balance. And so these are things and practices in this section where she talks about engaging with our lives outside of work, cultivating spaces and places where we're not on and not responsible for the same things we are when we're at work, and about moving energy through and cultivating practices of gratitude. And so you can see on the right side of that slide, we've just put together all of the different questions that come from the different directions. I know I just breezed through that really quickly, but Sally, do you want to talk about one of these directions?
Well, I wanted to, I'm just not sure if everyone's familiar with the term trauma mastery, and I think that's an important concept. And, you know, if you've, the idea of trauma mastery is that if you have experienced trauma, you know, complex or just a one-time trauma, but that sense of being so totally out of control, where there's chaos reigning. The idea of trauma mastery is that you return to those situations to be able to see if you can master them. And of course, that sounds like a good idea, but it can be, I mean, it can be healthy, but I have seen people, and again, particularly around doing domestic violence and child sexual abuse work, people who are counselors, that, you know, going to that place over and over again because they want to master their own situation. So it's just always a good question, you know, that goes along with, why am I doing this? What compels me? Is there some element of my own? And sometimes it doesn't look exactly the same at all. So it takes a little more work to look more deeply into what trauma might I be trying to master? And we have to remember there's a lot of different kinds of trauma. So, but I think it's an important concept.
Yeah, me too.
To think about. And I guess one thing I would say that is a very helpful practice is gratitude, and just remembering, you know, after, say, a particularly terrible month or year or week or day, that to really take the time to center and then think about what you're grateful for. Just very simply, I think it's a good practice, and it kind of shifts your energy away from the negative pit that you can fall into. So I think that's a really good practice. And I too, I just can't even emphasize enough how community and creating that microculture, I agree with you, Emily, that is so critical. So critical. So yeah, I love the that the daily practices, whatever it is about coming home to yourself, your most awakened, enlightened, or, you know, awakened self. Because that's what you lose. You lose yourself, you know, you can lose your deepest connection with your deepest self. And anything that can bring that to you is good. Now, I have a little mindfulness bell on my phone. And so when I'm having a hard time, I set it and it goes ding. And then I just have to pull back and, you know, get reconnected. And that, you know, those practices can, you know, disrupt bad habits and bring new habits into being. So.
And that's such a great example of something that is practical and doable, you know, in your daily life, that you found that particular bell is helpful. One of the things that I love, and maybe we can go to the next slide to talk about this a little more, is so much of, you'll notice in the book, in the directions chapters, at the end of each section, there's a try this little segment. And one of the reasons why these are so helpful is because they are, I think, doable, at least once. You can at least try them once and see how it goes. I think in trauma stewardship and our self-care things, we have to identify things that are actually possible for us to do.
Absolutely.
And not always be so aspirational that we feel like we're always failing in our self-care attempts. And so we just wanted to lift this one up as an example, and then maybe people who are online, if you want to send in your chat of things that you do, maybe you have a mindfulness bell on your phone or things that you do throughout your day to help you center yourself. So here's one example. One suggestion from the book is before starting your workday, this is on page 150, take a moment to literally stop in your tracks and ask yourself, why am I doing what I'm doing? So really just writing down maybe a sentence or a word or a phrase. After you hear your answer, remind yourself gently that you're making a choice to do this work. Take a deep breath, breathe in both the responsibility and the freedom in this acknowledgement. Second step, regularly consult with someone about why you're doing this, why you're doing what you are doing. Choose a trustworthy, supportive, wise person. Ask this person to listen attentively and provide you with feedback. It's critical to not be isolated in our work. So you keep hearing us say that over and over again. Find someone who knows why you're doing what you're doing and talk to them about that and listen to their answer to the same question. And then they, finally regularly write down why you are doing what you're doing and what your intention is, and keep it somewhere that you can see. When you feel yourself going astray, return from that client consult or staff meeting or board retreat and find your written intention. Remind yourself what it is about for you and what it is definitely not about. And then try to find those ways that you can slowly get closer back to that reason why you're doing what you're doing. And I think a lot of that is self-awareness, and a lot of that is building that microculture in your community, organization, wherever you are. So I don't know if you all listening have things like this that you do, or things in the book that you particularly connected with and that feel like you want to explore them more, or questions that you have about anything that we've talked about. We would be happy to hear your thoughts. Sarah, are there any questions that you have or comments that you see that we don't see?
So there is one question, and basically it's, so you're basically two different generations of activists. And so Sally, what have you done to kind of sustain yourself through this career? Words of advice for the youngins who might be in attendance. And Emily, what are the things that you have inherited that have been valuable in this kind of trauma stewardship realm?
Okay, so, and I have been doing this a long time, so I have had different kinds of practices maybe over the year, but honestly, having a spiritual practice has been critical, and keeping that to a pretty daily level. And I've, on a really basic everyday stuff, I've spent a lot of time journaling. I've gone through periods where it was so important for me. I think she mentions this in one of the quadrants, but like I just do visual things. I paint or draw, or I also have a little practice of writing haiku, which for some reason I really like that, because it's so simple, and sometimes I just have something comes to me, and it actually, I wanted to say that in this these questions that we had, what am I doing? Why, what am I doing? What am I doing what I'm doing? Or why am I doing what I'm doing? Sometimes you don't know that, and that's okay. I just want to say that that's really okay, and that it's these practices of doing something really different, like, again, for me, painting, or doing collage, or doing colors, have kind of shift my mind. And my friends have been incredibly important. I have a few people that I can really go deep with on the issues of trauma that I've worked with for many years, and I think everybody needs a kind of, you know, a soul friend in the trauma work. They call John O'Donohue calls that anum cara. So you need someone who's almost like a confessor too. You know, you need someone, or even a covenant group of people that you gather with. So, you know, community and spiritual practice for me have made all the difference. And I have really loved the people I work with. And that I've really been grateful to be doing the work. I understand it as sacred, and it's very, you know, there's a lot that's precious about it for me. And so I try to focus on that when it gets really hard. And it does get hard. It does get hard. And it gets hard after 30 years sometimes when the same conversations are happening. And the challenge as I've gotten older has been not to get discouraged and to feel that, you know, we can just keep pushing on. And then there's great young generation coming below. So that's wonderful. Yeah. So.
Well, yeah, I love this question. I think it's good. And, you know, a lot of my response to it doesn't sound that different from Sally's. I think one thing that I have inherited is the benefit of being around people who have decades of experience and really being in organizations and communities where there is representation of, you know, the pioneers and elders. And I've had the benefit of being around many of those people, and they have, you know, just hearing their stories gives a historical perspective that I think is really helpful for any young activist in any community, is really knowing your history and understanding where you've come from and what has come before you, I think is really crucial. And being able to have that perspective of people who have been doing, you know, what needs to be done all the time, again and again, just gives perspective and insight. And I don't know, I don't know how to put that, but it's a beautiful aspect of intergenerational work, I think. At the same time, like things that have helped me are things that have helped Sally. So I have a core group of friends who are also doing, you know, work in abuse and religion, or who are social workers who have been doing gender-based violence work since we all finished college and found work in these fields. And so keeping in touch with them and being able to debrief and, you know, encourage and commiserate and all of those things has been so helpful and important. And then finding my own practices that really root me. For me, it's creative pursuits. So I was just reading my watercolor book today, and, you know, planning some art projects and things that really keep me rooted and grounded. But for me, it's been friends and art and the wisdom of elders. And so, you know, there's some universals here, I think, of people who are engaged in this work.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that. I think over the years I think self-compassion, which she talks about a lot in there, but just forgiving oneself and being gentle oneself and with those around you, and living in a merciful, you know, environment. It's really important, and not underestimating that, even though sometimes it seems like, and this is a trauma response, it seems like we haven't done enough, or we, you know, I used to go, oh, we could do so much more. But to not underestimate how small acts, or just being present to someone, or just momentary things can have tremendous impact and resonate and reverberate over time. And so we don't know. I mean, we will never know what effect we have on people that we have been able to give our presence to. And that's why it's good not to want to have results. But I think I've just grown to trust that, because it's happened to me, you know, what people giving to me. So I think we should never underestimate the small stuff.
That's so true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Other things, Sarah, that we should wrap up with? I know we're at our time.
Yeah. So just one last question. Basically, someone who's asking for advice regarding an organization that is not trauma aware, and trying to do the work in an organization that isn't sustaining the people who are doing the work, or probably not the clients either. Any words of wisdom or insight?
Oof, that's hard. Well, first of all, really, I think work with this book and ask a lot of questions for the person asking. And then just seeing where the maybe the openings are for bringing that to the organization. Of course, that always puts pressure on the people or the person who understands that there needs to be trauma-informed care. But maybe trying to find what those openings are and see how far they are, and then just maybe make some timelines for yourself if that's not healthy for you. That doesn't mean that you're abandoning anybody if you decide that you might need to do something different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I think, in thinking about finding the openings, maybe there's one other person at the organization who feels the same way. Often these are topics when they get brought up and put out in the open, people are like, yeah, me too. That is my experience.
Yeah.
But it may not be the case. And it, like Sally said, it does put pressure on the person who's experiencing this. But maybe you could find someone in another organization or outside of your setting that you can talk with and begin to strategize. If it does feel possible, I think this book is a great thing to do as a staff, a great, this is a book club, but a great thing that you can say, let's read this book as a staff over the next 6 months and take section by section. Mm-hmm. That would be one suggestion. Find the openings, maybe use this book as a resource or connect to other people outside of your current setting.
Yeah, and I would also say there are some resources here on the screen that these are articles or web hubs, so you can perhaps share some of these links with your coworkers. One of them that's kind of interesting is the Professional Quality of Life Self-Test, which tests you for compassion, satisfaction, burnout, and secondary traumatic stress. So it's just a quick little survey, and then you can figure out how to score it. And it's one of those just good way to kind of do a little self-evaluation. In the handouts, all of these resources are on PDF, so you can download that. So any final words about this before we kind of move to thinking about our next book?
I don't know. I mean, I would obviously encourage everyone to read the book, of course, but also, as I said in the beginning, take it slow and be gentle with yourself, and find someone that you can talk about it with and read it with.
Yeah.
That'd be my last word.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's, and maybe, just take a look at this, the circle in the back of the book, and see what calls you, and start there, and move back.
Good idea.
Yeah, that's great advice.
And
Thank you so much.
And just be kind to yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody. So we haven't quite figured out what our next book club is going to be about. So we have 4 books that we're considering. One is called The Gospel of Winter. It's a young adult novel about clergy abuse, which I know sounds terrible, but it's won lots of awards. The other that we're looking at is called Speak. And again, it is a young adult novel about sexual assault. We're kind of thinking that if we read these in the summer and have a book club maybe in June or July, if you have kids or grandkids who are in the teen ages, it might be a good thing to kind of read a book with them and then have a conversation. Another option is It's Not That Bad, Dispatches from Rape Culture, which is edited by Roxane Gay. It has not yet come out, so I don't know what it's like, but all of her books are fabulous. So
she's so good.
Yeah. And then the last one is the Child Safeguarding Policy for Churches and Ministries, which is a really practical handbook. And again, we haven't read it, so we're kind of interested in talking about it. So I'm just going to launch a little poll here. And if people would just take a minute and let us know if they're interested in any of these books, I'd be grateful for your feedback. It doesn't mean that you have to join us for the book club, but just let us know if any of them are of interest. Okay, so far Roxanne Gay is winning.
Yeah, I'm voting. I want to vote for her too.
Child Safeguarding Policy. Okay, that's up there. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. Thank you for joining us for that. Just to let everybody see the results. 71%, the Roxanne Gay book.
Okay.
All righty.
That sounds fabulous.
Oh, great.
And let's see, is there anything else we need to tell you? No, we will let you know when our next book club is. Thank you so much, Sally. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you.
It was wonderful to have you with us this evening.
It was very fun. Yeah.
Great to be with you.
Thanks,
Thanks, Sally.
Bye. Thank you, Emily. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye. Talk to you soon.
Mm.